Oi, gente, bom dia. A gente vai dar início, então, à palestra com a professora Renata Enghels, da Universidade de Gent, na Bélgica. Queria, logo no começo, né, então, agradecer a vinda da Renata ao Brasil, né, que era algo que a gente vinha planejando há bastante tempo. Antes da pandemia, inclusive, ela estava com a passagem comprada, né, Renata? Para vir para o Brasil. E, bom, aí a gente sabe tudo que se desenrolou desde 2020. Então, nesse meio tempo, eu consegui esse projeto da FAPESP, né, que está, então, possibilitando a vinda dela, né, ao Brasil. E a gente, então, com isso, a gente encerra, né, esse projeto que eu tenho da FAPESP, que eu sou pesquisadora principal, que é sobre insubordinação no português e semi-insubordinação, a partir de uma perspectiva construcional. Então, essa é a razão, né, de a Renata poder participar, né, desse projeto. Você está entendendo, não? E de poder estar relacionado com esse projeto. Que, então, conta com o apoio, né, e o financiamento da FAPESP. Então, é muito bom que it's very nice that you're here. After so many visits I made to Ghent in Belgium, it was time for you to see UFSCar and to come to Brazil. So thank you very much indeed. And then Renata is a specialist in Spanish linguistics at the University of Ghent. Her research group is linguistic meaning structure. There's a lot of things else. And you can glimpse. And she works with Spanish linguistics, but also with social linguistics, as she's going to present here, with construction grammar, with code switching, Spanglish, Flemish sign languages, what else? And a range of topics that it's amazing. So today she's going to talk to us about language change in youth language, taking into account studies that she's been developing with her students and her advisees in Ghent about the Spanish spoken in Madrid and just in Madrid. So that's it. We can start, and thank you so much again. And thank you for you to come and the ones that are watching us online.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for being here. And well, Flávia, thank you for that was a good reaction of mine. After a jet lag, I still have reaction times. So thank you for the invitation and for allowing me to come to Brazil and to talk about my different research topics. So in the course that I'm teaching and also this talk that I will give today. And as Flávia already announced, indeed, it's about recent language change in teenage talk. But I mentioned the case studies from Spanish, but I hope that, whatever language you're working with, the ideas that I will be presenting are also useful for other languages, including Brazilian or Portuguese, okay? But I would like to start with a disclaimer, because when I started to present and to prepare this talk, just the day before, I went to a very nice museum in Ghent, quite recent museum, which is called the GUM. The GUM is the Ghent University Museum and Botanical Garden. So it's the University Museum of Ghent University. It's recent, and so it's really interesting. So if you have the time to visit it, if you would come to Belgium, I would certainly advise you to do that, because what they do is that they try to reconstruct the whole research process. So what does a researcher do? What does he or she start from, etc., etc. And so they present the most interesting inventions and creations of, well, the professors of Ghent University over time. And there I saw a number of slogans and ideas that I think would also apply to the talk that I will be delivering today. Well, so one of the first ones is the following. So sometimes you have to start with a blank sheet to come up with new insights, because what I will be presenting today are some provisional results of a number of projects that are going on in our research group. And so the starting point of any kind of research, so I guess anyone who has experience with research, is indeed chaos. So that you are confronted with a number of data, structures, tokens, examples. And well, I won't read the whole paragraph, but what is said here is that, well, what we want to do as researchers, if it is linguistics, biology, doesn't matter, you want to get grip with the chaos. And so a scientist, as you can see here, so what you want to do is you want to find classifications, you want to find the criteria, and then you will see that some items belong to the classification, but of course that also others will not belong to the classification. And then in the end, what you ask yourself as a researcher is, well, if you find some order in the chaos, does that order truly exist? Or is it something that we as scientists want to impose on that reality? Okay, so this, as Flavia already said, what I will be presenting today is the result of ongoing projects in our research group. And in fact, it started already 6 years ago with the PhD research of Linde, that you can see here. So Linde is an assistant in our department. And so she came to talk to me in 2017, and she told me, well, I want to study intensification. So intensification in Spanish. And so very quickly, well, we noticed that it's a really interesting phenomenon in teenage talk. And then 1 year later, Fien de Latte joined the group with a PhD on terms of address, so vocatives, so how you address the others. And again, we noticed that this is really interesting in teenage talk. Now, in a parallel way, I had been developing research with a professor from Madrid, Elena Sofra, on pragmatic markers. And again, we noticed that if you want to study data, teenage talk is a really fruitful, productive source of information. And then more recently, we have Nele. So Nele is also engaged in the PhD study. And well, together with Nele, we are trying to get a grip of the overarching principles and parameters that are related to intensification vocatives, but other phenomena as well, as I will show during this talk. So what I am presenting today is really the result of collaborations with all those persons. So instead of presenting the bibliography at the end of the talk, I would like to start by showing a list of research outcomes. So what I will do is try to see some general patterns, tendencies based on the different case studies we did together, okay? So they are here as well. I'm not the only one sitting at the table. Okay, so first of all, some background and also the research questions that we will ask or ask ourselves and of course try to answer today and in the future. So why would it be interesting to study the language of teenagers? Well, I would like to start by showing you three paintings, in fact, that represent different time periods. I don't know if you recognize any of them, but here at the left, we have a painting, a medieval painting. Then in the middle, that would be a painting from the Renaissance. And here, I don't know if anyone recognizes this one, that's a painting from Picasso, so beginning of the 20th century. And what do they show? Well, they show that over time in society, more attention has been paid to the central role of children and also of teenagers. So here in the Middle Ages, well, in the art, you will never see teenagers or children represented. maybe Jesus, but he will always have a face of an adult then. You see that in the Renaissance, that started to change, but still, and these are more like adults than like really children. And then starting from, well, the 19th, but especially the beginning of the 20th century, you see that the family, the child, the adolescents, they start to take an important role in society and as well in the art. Now, we could continue because we see that in the 21st century, this really changed dramatically. I don't know if you know this girl in Europe. She's really famous, Greta Thunberg. She's a teenager and she was elected Person of the Year by Time a couple of years ago. And so I also brought two examples from the Flemish, the Belgian context. So in 2021, there was a whole exposition devoted to teenagers in Belgium, something that would be impossible before. So it was called Teen Spirit. And last year we had a priest in Antwerp who, well, translated the Lord's Prayer in his mass in teenage talk. So he said, well, teenagers, they don't come to church because they are not familiar with the language, the classical language that we use. So he translated it. So it sounded a bit funny. He used words like bro, etc., etc. But well, he thought that that would be like a good strategy, well, to come to them. Now, let's go and have a look at the Spanish society. Well, so the interest for teenagers and in general, the teenage culture, it started in the USA. So in America already in the 60s, flower power, etc. It was mostly an underground culture. And then in the 70s decade, it finally arrived in Spain. So for those who are familiar with the context of Spain, you know that the 70s was quite an important decade. It was the end of the time of Franco. And so a new political awareness was born. So there was a transition towards democracy. Now, at the same time, there was a worldwide crisis. So apparently we have had crisis all over. But then also at that age. And so you could see that in Spain, you had two important different social classes. So on the one hand, you had the group of what you could call the apathetic youth. So that were the teenagers, the young people that were like, okay, I'm not getting involved. I'm not looking for a job. So it was the attitude of pasotismo, mainly found in the lower classes. And then on the other hand, you also had what you could call the preppy youth. So the higher social class, which would be called in Spanish, the pijos. Now, this is important because later on, when we will have a look at what happens in Madrid today, the distinction between these two social classes is still important and still determines, well, the kind of structures and the language that they are using. I also wanted to mention La Movida Madrileña because it's really, well, important for the Spanish society and it has consequences until now. So that was a movement, mainly a cultural movement, so also led by young people in the 70s and in the 80s, also underground, like in the USA. And the idea was, okay, it was a culture of non-conformity, freedom of expression. So they opposed to the adults, to politics, the ongoing cultures. And well, they used, so the youth language was for the first time used as an anti-language. Now, what happened back then? Well, that underground scene, that underground culture had a lot of connections with marginal and delinquent the Madrid environments. So we can still see in the colloquial Spanish of today that a lot of expressions that are still used, they come from the, well, a kind of lexicon that had to do with bandits and with, well, delinquency. So for instance, as you can see here in this list, we will not go over the list, but there are a lot of terms that refer to the police, to drugs, etc., etc. So they are still found in the lexicon today. But of course, we will be interested today and also in the projects that are ongoing in language or teenage talk as it changed or changes over the 21st century. Because, well, we think that the 21st century is a really interesting time period to observe. So you do not always, when you look at language change, have to look at, I don't know, the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or a whole whole area. So just looking at a short time period can also be very interesting, because what happened? What happened in Spain, but also in other societies? So first of all, you all know there was the rise of social media, Instagram, TikTok, etc., etc. Now, this means that what you get also in the culture and in the daily life of teenagers is that they have more mediated interactions. So instead of talking to each other directly, and adults as well, we talk to each other, using WhatsApp and written messages. Now, this is of course important, but at the same time, the consequence is that the language that is used in those messages, which is really informal, also tends to spread to language use in general. So we notice that, for instance, students, when they address their professors, well, it's more hard for them to make a distinction between formal and informal language use. Secondly, of course, you also know that the 21st century, partly due to these social media, is characterized by increasing internationalization, increasing phenomena of language contact. Now, you might say, well, that happened before. Well, in the Spanish context, this is really important. So you see that with YouTube, with Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon, etc., for the first time, they have direct access to movies and series in the Spanish language. Whereas in other countries, in Portugal and other countries in Europe as well, and I think here in Brazil, before you already had access to movies and series in English. Well, it was not the case in Spanish society. So this left traces during the 21st century. And then finally, well, it's the age of a new generation. It's the Generation Z. And we will see later on that it's a generation that is characterized by changing gender identities. So the difference between boys and girls is, well, you could say, more neutralized or more complicated than ever before. And this might also have an impact on language behavior if you look at it from a socio-linguistic perspective. Now, we've been noticing in the bibliography there has been a rising interest for the teenage talk. So this goes parallel to the importance that society gives to this social group. And so teenagers, so when I talk about teenagers, for me, these are young persons between the age of 12 and 18. They have always been defined as linguistic innovators. So if you have teenagers in your direct environment, you will have noticed that they really want to express their in-group identity. So they use a particular language to show, okay, you pertain to our group. So they will really want to use those linguistic phenomena. Therefore, they have also been defined as active neologizers. What does it mean? Well, teenagers, they want to express their in-group identity, but of course, they are in contact with people from an older generation, their parents, their professors. And we, from the Gen 3, we want to rejuvenate ourselves. So what do we do? In conversations, there are processes of priming, accommodation, etc., etc. So sometimes we copy their linguistic behavior. Well, they're not happy with that. And again, they will try to neologize and find new linguistic expressions. So what you get here is a cycle of action and reaction. And so in the end, this could, not always the case, but this could contribute to language change. So this is just to say that, as I said before, you don't always have to, when you want to do historical linguistics, look at changes that take place over centuries of time. As Arts says here, it's also interesting to look at recent linguistic changes, so changes that take place over decades rather than centuries. Okay, so I'm certainly not the first one to study youth language. So there's a lot of work out there, but what we tried to do was, well, we tried to summarize the main characteristics that are found in different languages. So we were trying to find some universals of teenage talk, if you would like to put it that way. And so which are then the key characteristics? So first of all, you could see that teenagers mostly use expressive language. Now, the idea of expressive language, creative language use, it's quite hard to define. But for us, expressive language is, well, complies with the following definition. So this means that they will use a lot of items that are semantically independent, meaning that, well, these are items that do not really have a referential meaning, but they put it in their discourse because they want to express their emotions, their stance, their attitudes. And so that is what expressive language is about. A second property is vague language use. Now, this might seem a bit contradictory to the idea of expressive language use, but at the same time, you notice that what they do is that they use a lot of recurring elements, items, that really don't clearly have a function. So these are forms that are all over the place, and it's, as a linguist, really hard to define what they mean. So I will give some examples later on. And then a last characteristic, of course, again, is the idea of language contact. So what we see in Europe, at least, is a kind of juvenile Anglomania, as it has been called. So everything that comes from, well, everything that is in English is considered as interesting. And of course, you have a lot of lexical and also, to some extent, syntactic borrowings. Now, as I said, people have discovered these characteristics before. But what we noticed was that often in the sources that we consulted, people in much detail describe these phenomena, and this is really necessary. But, well, they propose different case studies, and as such, a rather monolithic perspective. So I will explain later on what I mean by this. But what we would like to do in the overarching process is then, well, try to compare the different characteristics and the change in which they are involved at different levels. So we think that the three main characteristics of expressivity, vagueness, and language contact can both be found at the lexical level and also at the syntactic level. So just to give you some more details, so at the lexical level, of course, what we see is that they have their own slang. Yeah, this includes the intensifiers that we will study. This includes the vocatives that we will study, and of course, also the recurrent use of taboo words. Now, the high degree of expressivity can also be found at the syntactic level. So I don't know about Portuguese, but in Spanish, what you see is that teenagers, when they start a sentence and, well, they don't know how to continue, what they often do is interrupt their sentence to the argument structure of a verb, of a noun phrase, and you get like recurrent syntactic inclusions, which are often also taboo words. These are called in the bibliography for Spanish the tacos. Then, as to the second characteristic, the one of vagueness, we see that they recurrently use pragmatic markers. Now, pragmatic markers, they are not always to be defined as vague, but you see that they have elements such as en plan, I will come back to that later on, that is also all over the place. It's really hard to define the pragmatic functions. Vagueness at the syntactic level, that would be found in what we see in syntactic simplifications. So again, they start a sentence, they have some trouble continuing their message, and then they put these items to, well, to change direction of their message. So in Spanish, there is the expression es que, it is that. But it's also recurrently repeated, and, well, what does it mean? Hard to define. And then finally, of course, as to language contact, there are lexical borrowings and syntactic borrowings. Now, what did we find in the many sources that we consulted? Well, people talk about language change and adolescence as, well, contributors to historical change, but they provide a rather homogeneous model, meaning that they say, okay, they contribute to language change. But we would like to empirically monitor and check the impact of the nature of the phenomenon on, for instance, the speed of the linguistic change, right? So, for instance, how fast does a phenomenon related to expressivity at the lexical level change? How can we compare this with language contact, etc., etc.? So how fast do they change, when, and where exactly? So therefore, it's necessary to have a kind of a longitudinal study and to empirically check and verify, instead of saying, okay, that's what they do. We are not sure because, well, you need to quantify and provide qualitative investigations. So this has led us to a list of 5 research questions. So I will briefly present them here, but I will come back to them later on when I will present some results. So first of all, of course, we want to know how and to what extent Spanish teenage talk has changed over the past 20 years. So do these societal differences leave important traces in the language, yes or no? Secondly, does it interact with the sociolinguistic profile of the teenagers, boys and girls, different social classes? Then, in the literature, some people say that children are responsible for language change, sometimes the adults. Well, what about adolescents? Can we confirm this? Fourth research question has to do with the phenomenon of age grading. What is this? Well, normally it's assumed that you get the main features of your speech during your adolescence, and then when you're adult, that it stays quite fixed. Well, we need to monitor that and see if this really is the case. And then finally, from a more comparative perspective, we would also like to find out whether there are then universals of youth language related to these phenomena of linguistic change. Okay, so which are the data that we will use and which is the methodology that we will apply? What we do is then we conduct different microdiachronic analyses of Spanish youth language. So in concrete, we conduct comparative real-time analyses. And so we compare the language of the second generation at the beginning of the 21st century. So that would be the speech of the generation of the millennials. So those that were born in the 80s and the 90s, with the language of Gen Z, born in the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century. Now, we do this by comparing 2 corpora. And luckily, we have those corpora. So for the speech of the millennials for Spanish, we have the COLAM corpus. So Corpus de Lenguaje Adolescente de Madrid. And then for the most recent period, we have in Ghent the CORMA corpus. I will come back to that corpus later on. Now, this idea, we presented it at some conferences and we had some very attentive colleagues who said, okay, that's nice and that you want to compare those corpora, but if you want to be sure and you need to be sure that there are differences that you're observing between those 2 corpora, you have to be sure that the only factor that has an impact is the time factor. Because of course, if your samples are not balanced, then it could also be that, well, because you have more women in your corpus, that you think you see a change, but that there is no change. So you really have to work with highly comparable samples. Now, my dearest colleagues, Linde, Fien, and Nele, they carefully inspected both corpora. And so we came up with a subcorpus of those 2 bigger corpora that, where we are quite sure that it contains a comparable number of participants with very similar sociolinguistic profiles as to social class and gender. And what is also important is that the conversations are between equal numbers of participants, because it's quite different if you have a conversation between 2 speakers or 3 or 4. And then it also has an impact on language use. So this is then, just to give you some numbers, we won't look at them in detail, but it shows that here we have more or less comparable subsamples as to males and females, lower and higher classes, both for the COLAM corpus and the CORMA subcorpus. Now, I think this is also a very nice opportunity for me to be able to present our CORMA corpus. We're quite proud of that project. CORMA is Corpus Oral del Español Hablado en Madrid. So it's something that we created ourselves. Why? Because it's really, I don't know if anyone has the experience, but it's really time consuming and it's really expensive. Why did we did that? Well, on the First, you could say that we observed that in general, people are more interested in studying spontaneous conversations, right? We as well, we think that there are so many interesting phenomena that are there and still need some description. But at least for Spanish, it was really hard to find suitable empirical data. It's quite different from English, but for Spanish, there wasn't too much available that really had spontaneous conversation. So in order to remedy the scarce documentation of colloquial Spanish in the 21st century, we made this corpus. It's the result of 3 fieldwork campaigns that we did. So first one in 2016, that was like the recording of a general corpus, different generations. So we wanted to see how it would go. And then in 2019, Fina and Linde went back 2 times, really to have conversations between teenagers, once for the middle high class and another time for the middle low class. We decided to work with the variety spoken in the capital city because it's said in the literature that, well, you can expect to find the most innovative linguistic fashion in the capitals. So that's what happens in Europe, at least, because, well, we don't have a lot of big cities, but normally you find the innovations there and then they spread to the periphery. So the capital is also said to have, well, prestige. As to the recording process, I'm not going into details, but I just wanted to, well, give as an information that we worked with recruits. So since we are not native speakers, we couldn't be involved too much ourselves. And we have 2 types of recordings. So on the one hand, the semi-secret recordings. So for instance, we went to a hairdresser and the hairdresser was aware of the fact, of course, that he or she was going to record it. And when he or she was with the client, he wore a microphone. Afterwards, of course, everyone was informed about the recording process. And then we also have ordinary recordings. For instance, in the setting of a family, everyone knew that there was a recorder there. But even then, we see that they start to gossip about other persons. So at some point, they are not aware of the fact that, well, we are recording their conversations. So they have been transcribed. And at this time, so we are, well, in the final phase of revision, because it's quite a process. You could say that it is a direct corpus as opposed to, for instance, Sketch Engine or the bigger databases, because it's really a direct reflection. And we have about 100 informal conversations. According to the definition of what a real colloquial conversation is, well, we can say that the corpus is quite prototypical. There is equality among the participants. It is really a familiar discourse context. There is no planning, so it's not an interview. And, well, they talk about the weather, they talk about friends. It's really the interpersonal purpose, well, that you find there. So, yeah, we got a corpus of around 60 hours. We have 4 communicative settings. There are family conversations, and the largest part, as you can see here, are conversations between friends. So this is also, well, interesting, especially for the teenagers. We have a few conversations between acquaintances, so for instance, colleagues, and then also conversations here, what we call atención al cliente. That's, for instance, well, the shops, the pharmacy, the hairdresser. Then we also took into account the profile of the speakers as to generation, gender, and social class. So a lot of data come from the 2nd generation, so that's good. As to the profiles, I don't know if you have the same experience, but often you see that the women tend to be, well, more ready to contribute to research and I don't know, experiments. So we see that we have more data for women than for men. But of course, we take it into account when we look at quantities. As to social class, that's for us the most difficult parameter. So we started by looking at the area where the people came from. So in Spain, in Madrid, well, there are clear barrios where you could see, okay, this is the higher class, these are middle, lower classes. So we defined the social class on the basis of that, but you see that still here we have a lot of, well, conversations with participants that we don't know which social class they belong to, because you can't really ask it. In the end, we decided to work with 2 categories, namely the middle high class and the low class, because we noticed that the middle class and the high class have quite similar linguistic behavior. So we will be looking at the data for the second generation. So here as well, you see that there are more girls involved in the project than boys. But again, we will take that imbalance into account. Which are the parameters that we will look at? Now, frequency. We start just by looking at frequency of phenomena. We consider it to be a measure of productivity. So first of all, how frequent is, for instance, the use of taboo words? And also type frequency. So how many different taboo words do they use? And that's then type frequency. And then, of course, if you want to go and look at it in more detail, then you have to look at the paradigms themselves. So meaning that we are interested in checking the forms that appear, that disappear, that are diffused. So which forms disappear, which one stays, etc., etc. Now, this is an ongoing project. And so I've indicated here in the color green, what is, the phenomena that we already have some results for. So intensifiers, vocatives, pragmatic markers, and syntactic simplifications. The idea is to get results for all of the phenomena in the end so that we can compare them. So this means that when I will be referring to intensification, vocatives, SK, etc., that this is all work done in collaboration with these colleagues. Now, let us have a look at some first results. So first of all, I don't know if you remember, but the first research question was, how has Spanish teenage talk changed over the past 20 years? We first look at the phenomena individually, so what has happened, which forms disappear, which forms are created, and then we compare the phenomena. Can we find comparable cycles of linguistic change? What about the importance of phenomena such as expressivity or vagueness? Does it all pertain to the same model or not? Also, we want to compare lexical and syntactic features. In the literature, people recurrently say, oh, the lexicon changes much faster than syntax. But, well, we really need quantitative data to be, able to confirm these ideas. So, some first results. We will be comparing two lexical features that pertain to the category of high expressivity, namely intensifiers and vocatives. So I brought a paragraph where you can see that both of them are quite productive. So here, for instance, you have a todo guapo tia, which is really handsome girl. So tío, tia is, like dude in English. Super majo, super nice. Me enamoré, tia. I fell in love with him, literally girl or dude. Me enamoré que flipas. I fell in love like crazy. So many intensifiers and vocatives. And indeed, in the literature, those two phenomena have also been defined as, phenomena that are really present in youth speech and that would change at top speed. So different authors say that, especially for intensification, they are really highly fashionable. And so when a fashion changes, they are victim of that and they can disappear and come, etc., etc. Also, as to the vocatives, they have also been defined as, the area where striking changes took place, because often they are involved in phenomena of grammaticalization. So, is this really the case? As to the nature of the phenomena themselves, so I said that they relate to expressivity. Indeed, if you use an intensifier, that is because you want to express your own emotions, so your own stance. The same for vocatives, dude, so you are expressing your emotions, but it's a bit different because, you directly direct your attention to the interlocutor. So it's also interpersonal. Now, as to the phenomena themselves, of course, they are not homogeneous. You have different types of intensifiers. So some are more expressive than others. So for instance, if you use in Spanish, que flipas, that's much more expressive than super. Super is a prefix, but it's used by many different generations. It's quite common. The same goes for the vocatives. If you use, for instance, dude, if I call you dude, that's quite different than if I would just call you Flavia. It has a bigger impact. So we have to take that into account as well. Now, let us have a look at the token frequency. So again, we compare the speech of the millennials with the speech of Gen Z. I have the data for the intensifiers and the vocatives. So these are the data for the intensifiers, so the normalized frequencies per 10,000 words in the corpus. And you see that, well, the intensifiers are quite frequent in the language of the millennials, but they have doubled in the language of Gen Z. So this shows that apparently in 20 years' time, well, people are using more expressive language. Now, what happens with the vocatives? Here you see that in general, the vocatives are more widespread already. They have also increased, but it's perhaps less dramatic. It isn't really more than a doubling, but well, still, it is quite important. So dude, etc., a guy, well, they are used more frequently as well. So there is a considerable rise of frequency, which could coincide with what was defined before as, well, the language that has become more informal and rising colloquialization. But as we will see later on, maybe it also has to do with a particular social class that has taken the lead in this linguistic change. Now, I already said that we cannot consider these phenomena as homogeneous phenomena. And if we want to dive more deeply into these phenomena of change, we have to look at the degree of expressivity. And you see that, for instance, there are 3 levels of expressivity. If you use in your addressing of the interlocutor a form like tu, this is okay, interpersonal, but well, it's not so expressive, right? So it's the least expressive vocative. And the same goes for prefixes and suffixes that are intensifiers. So in Spanish, you have the ísimo and you have the super. They're already mentioned by grammar, so they are quite common. In the middle, you have forms for the vocatives like tío, guy, literally uncle, but it has grammaticalized and now it's guy. Hombre, so man, but well, also grammaticalized, so it's quite common. It's neutral, it's semantics. For the intensifiers, you have mazo. Mazo has grammaticalized from hammer. So hammer, and then it has undergone a very complicated process, and now it's an intensifier. And todo, so whole. And then the most expressive ones are, of course, the taboo words. You have for the vocatives, you have cabron, you have tronco, really marked. And then, of course, for the intensifiers, there is puto. So this is a taboo word. Now, if we take a look at the paradigms of intensifiers and how they have changed over 20 years, so we will not go into the details, but I would just like to invite you to have a look at the top 5 intensifiers. You see that, well, the same 5 appear and still are the most frequent ones. So we have mazo, we have ísimo, we have puto, we have super, and we have todo. There are some changes as to frequency, but it's not so dramatic as is often suggested in the literature. What about the vocatives? Well, there it's a bit different. You see that tu, that indeed was the least expressive form, is the most stable one, right? So its frequency doesn't really change. What did change was tronco. You know that we define tronco as the most the most expressive form. So a tronco is really the trunk of a tree. So if someone calls you tronco, it means that you're really dumb. And then, so it almost disappeared in 20 years' time. And then we had the tío, really the dude, that has, well, gone from 33% in the first corpus until 75 in the second corpus. So you can say that tío, well, I don't know how many times you would find it in a conversation with a teenager. It's sometimes quite annoying. Okay, so what happens then? The change of the paradigms is not so dramatic, I would say, right? There is stability of the standardized forms, so that is confirmed. And then you see that the most expressive forms indeed are involved in some cyclic changes. So this confirms the idea of action and reaction. And this seems to go more quickly for vocatives than for the intensifiers. Well, that's indeed what we can see from these first results. So this is matho, an intensifier. So it came up very quickly, remains quite stable. It's not disappearing, but we will see that some social class took over its use. This is the intensifier puto. So it's a taboo word. So you would expect that maybe it would disappear, but it's not the case. But it's losing a part of its semantics. It's not always considered anymore as a taboo word. And then we see that quite recently, we have the intensifier todo that has appeared in Spanish. We suspect, but it's still to be investigated, that this is a calque from the English totally. Totally is really fashionable in English today. So we think that they start to copy it, probably because they noticed it in series. For instance, the élite, well, that's in Spanish, but other series as well. Tronco disappeared really quickly and was substituted by tío. Yes, so these are the most important changes. Now, how could we explain these differences? Because this is what we're interested in, right? So not only describe the changes, but also describe, compare the phenomena. If they are both expressive phenomena, well, why are there some changes? Well, you could say that intensifiers and vocatives are, well, they're quite different. Because intensifiers, they express your stance. Vocatives, as I said before, express your own emotion, but also it's directed to your interlocutor. And since the in-group identity is so important, so how teenagers address the others, maybe their peers, the role of the peers and the forms that they use, well, is a more important trait of their sociolect. Also, what you get is that intensifiers are syntactically embedded, right? So they pertain to a nominal phrase, to a verbal phrase, whereas vocatives are peripheral. It's like pragmatic markers. So maybe it also has an impact. I'm saying maybe, so because these are hypotheses. We also think that what we do is that we compare two pictures. Unfortunately, we don't see what goes on in those 20 years. Maybe at some point, by accident, it's an intensifier that counts as, well, the identifying feature of their sociolect. And then maybe by accident, 20 years later, it's a vocative. So maybe they are just competing features among each other. So we're not sure yet. But just to finish up that part, I would like to just show some numbers as to changing productivity of another feature of youth language. Remember that I said that they also have vague language. So linguistic items that are all over the place and that you can't really define what they mean. So there is the element esque, so at the syntactic level. You have some examples here. For instance, in number 3, claro, es que yo no sé lo que gastas tú al día, es que eso habría que analizar. So people are talking, they don't know how to continue their sentence. They use es que, well, to start a new act, a new sentence within the sentence. So really, vagueness marker. Now, what about the changing frequency? Here you see that the productivity has not really gone up. Not as much as the most expressive feature. So esque was already quite frequent in the language of the millennials. And well, there is a small increase, but it has nothing to do with the numbers that we observed for the intensifiers. So yeah, it's interesting to compare the different levels, and you cannot say that they change any feature quickly or slowly. Okay. Do you have more time? Second question, also very interesting question, the variationist study. If we observe these changes, to what extent does the sociolinguistic profile of the teenagers play a role? This, of course, goes back to the first sociolinguistic wave, where they said that the macro sociological categories of your gender, of your age and social class determine your speech. So we want to find out if there is language variation and change. Does gender and social class, do they have an impact? What about the role of boys and girls? Or since in the 21st century, the social classes also have changed, maybe their language now has more neutralized. Which social class leads the language change? And does it really perhaps depend on, for instance, taboo words? Do girls use more taboo words than boys, and as such contribute more to language change? So this is also, that's why I referred to the idea of chaos at the beginning of my talk, because, well, you have many different phenomena, many different parameters, and so we are trying to get some order in that. I will just give you some examples. So as I already said, you guys already know that maso is an intensifier, right? So it's a quite neutral form nowadays. It wasn't always a neutral form before, but here you see, again, a context. So maso de chill, very chill. Me lo pasé maso bien, it went very well. So maso sometimes also appears recurrently in the speech. Okay. What happened? So here you see the data for the millennials, so the oldest corpus. And so you see that mostly maso was used in the speech of the higher social classes at the beginning of the 21st century. What happened over 20 years? Well, nowadays you see that maso has become a distinctive feature of the speech of girls of the higher class, so no longer the lower class. So this is what you could say, a case of a change from below. And you see that as soon as those girls started to use it, well, the other classes, boys, but also the lower classes in general, they have abandoned maso as a typical intensifier. Tio and tia, we already know this form, the vocative form. What happened here? Well, at the beginning of the century, you see that it was also equally spread among the social classes. But nowadays, again, tio and tia has become really a distinctive feature of the speech of the girls of the higher social class. Well, it's not abandoned by the other classes. It's becoming like hombre that is all over the place, but still, they are really exaggerating the use of tia and tio. So there seems to be an interaction between social class and gender. And there are some lexical traits that are typically found in the language of the girls of the higher class of Gen Z. So this is interesting to observe. But there is a but, there is more to be said about this. Because, well, if we think about the relationship between social classes, gender in particular, and then the kind of language that they use, I would say that this is really sociolinguistics from the first wave. So the idea was that girls and women in general, we would use effective language, we would be really polite, we use a lot of attenuation strategies, we talk about psychological topics, and if we contribute to language change, it's mostly with prestigious forms, right? So that is the cliche. That's the idea that has been expressed and accepted for a long time. Whereas men, they would have language with verbal aggression, a really direct style. They talk about sports and work, apparently. And if they contribute to language change, it's mostly with dialect forms, so vernacular forms. But, as I said before, the 21st century is quite different. So these conceptions about men and women, well, we don't know if they still apply to current speech because, well, there has been quite some empowerment, I would say, of girls and women over the 21st century. So this has made, I don't know, not life more complicated, but just different. So the traditional labels of what masculinity and femininity is, they have changed. Girls and women, there is empowerment, and the stereotyped social roles, they have also become more obsolete. Men can do the housekeeping. There is no problem with that. So you could say that men and women are less differentiated than ever. Okay, this is from the social perspective. Where does this lead us as to their language? There are two possible outcomes of these changes. So first of all, the first hypothesis could be that, okay, since this changes, maybe because of the changes of the feminine identity of Generation Z, the girls have become more aware of their role, maybe they develop their own language because they want to confirm and affirm their new identity. So that's one hypothesis. But there is also a second possible outcome that is just that, okay, maybe the speech of men and women is becoming more alike because these roles are being neutralized. Now, what do the data tell us? Let's go back to the intensifiers and the vocatives. Some hypotheses. If we start from the traditional point of view, well, we would expect that boys promote vernacular forms. So that's what they say, and the dialect form. So maybe the taboo intensifiers, the taboo vocatives, so puto and tronco, or idiota, idiot, more aggressive style, that should be found especially in the speech of the boys. And then, if we would still believe what was said before, the girls, they would spread the standard and prestigious language forms. So we would expect them to use more intensifiers like ísimo, and as to the vocative, the hombre, which is more neutral. Now, what happened? These are some data for the taboo intensifiers. So I brought the example of puto. Well, we're not going to the detailed analysis of puto, but we see that puto, at the beginning of the century, well, it was used especially by boys from the lower class and girls also from the lower class, but it was quite equally distributed. Now, what happened? You see that nowadays, puto is mostly found in the speech of the girls of the lower class. And so the boys, they seem to have abandoned, well, they don't have abandoned, but it's just less frequent. The girls of the higher class, they don't really use it. So it's the girls of the lower classes that tend to use it more. The taboo vocatives, like idiot, for instance, idiota. What happened here? Well, we see that at the beginning of the century, mostly boys from the lower class talk to each other with taboo vocatives. You don't really find it in the other classes, and now it's equally distributed, but also the girls from the higher class, they use more taboo forms, also for the vocative, so it's more equally distributed. The standardized forms, the ísimo, we would expect it to find more in the speech of the girls. This is what indeed happened at the beginning of the 21st century. So here in the speech of the millennials, you see that the girls of the higher class talk with ísimo. Buenísimo, guapísimo. It's always the ísimo. Nowadays, and this is quite strange, you see that in Korma, it's like the boys from the lower class that are using ísimo much more frequently. And the girls from the higher class and the other groups, well, it's not impossible, but it's just not a distinctive feature of their speech. And then finally, to complete this set of information, what happened with the hombre, that is also quite standardized. So again, you see that at the beginning of the century, it's mostly found in the speech of the girls of the lower class, but also in other classes. Hombre is not used anymore by girls. So they seem to have abandoned the hombre. Of course, that's because they have the tío and tía. But on the other hand, you see that the boys from the lower class, again, they tend to use hombre much more. So this is quite interesting. Something is happening with the speech of the girls indeed. And well, what we think is that indeed, what these data suggest is that the girls, so since there is a redefinition of their roles, they want to create their own feminine identity, and they use more taboo words and vernacular forms than their friends from a generation before. Now, the boys, what they seem to do is, well, you know, teenagers, boys and girls, there is quite some distance. Instead, they don't want to be associated with recurrent use of tío and en plan, and well, they go back to the standardized forms, maybe because, well, they want to be less expressive. So at least these data seem to confirm the first hypothesis. So that the changes in the feminine identity reflect is reflected in a new linguistic behavior. Now, we were not satisfied with this conclusion because we said, well, yeah, but girls, they're just more expressive, right? we are a bit more dramatic in general, so it's not so strange that the most expressive forms, taboo forms, that we would use them more over time. It's interesting to have a look also at the markers of vagueness to see whether there is some changes between the two genders, to see whether it has become more equal or more different. So we will have a look at ESCE again. Compare millennials, Gen Z, and what do we see here? Well, you see here that in the speech of the millennials, ESCE was a feature of the speech of the girls. So they used ESCE, 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 ESCE as a, well, very recurrently. Whereas nowadays, the use seems to is more balanced in the corpus. So these data then seem to go in the direction of hypothesis B, namely that the speech of men and women, girls and boys at least, is becoming more alike. This is just to say that you cannot generalize. You always have to look at the nature of the phenomenon. And just to wrap up that part, what about other pragmatic markers? So, well, I've been studying pragmatic markers like nada, sabes, there is en plan, as I already said. This is, for instance, some microdiachronic data for the use of nada in, well, in different generations. And so here we see that if you look at data from the third generation, so the adults, that there is a big difference between women and men. Yeah, so in my generation, for instance, especially women use nada, nada, pues nada, 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 nada. And the men, well, they do, but it's not so frequent. Whereas here in the second generation, you see that, well, boys and girls, they do not use it that frequently, and it's more balanced. It seems to be more neutralized. So again, this seems to go into the direction of hypothesis B as to the use of pragmatic markers. Now, the story doesn't end here, because if you talk about pragmatic markers, you have to look at en plan. En plan is the competitor of nada. It also has the attenuation function, because nada is like, I'm saying something, nada, so I want to, well, negate, and then I go on. We see that en plan really has over tripled in 20 years' time. So again, like Theo, you can imagine it is all over the place. Jurgensen, who developed the Column corpus, she found that en plan was a feature of the speech of the girls of the higher class, so especially girls of the higher class. We did a comparison with Korma as to the use of nada, and again we see that it's especially used by the higher class, but it's starting to spread to the lower class. It's especially found in the speech of the girls, but it starts to spread to the speech of the boys. So this is an intermediate image. So you see that again, this phenomena, well, it is found at an intermediate pace of neutralization or distinction. Now, to finish the part on the variationist study, sociolinguistics is, of course, much more than just looking into the social classes. The third sociolinguistic way, for instance, focuses on the individual role of the speaker and also the importance of the network. So when we change our language, we do this within our network. Well, what is the network of teenagers? Mostly their schools. So you would expect that different schools have maybe different profiles as to the use of some of these features. Now, Nele, she did a study of ESCE in different schools. So the bars that you see here, these are just frequencies for different schools that we visited in Madrid, right? So you see that it varies as to the frequency. In some schools, the ESCE is quite common. In others, well, you don't find it that recurrently in their conversations. But you see here that the idea of having a high-class school or a low-class school as to the use of ESCE, again, it doesn't really have an impact. Now, what do we see nowadays in Madrid? We already know, well, SK is quite common, but again, the high and the low class doesn't play a role. And much more than before, or much less than before, there is a difference between the schools. Here you could see that every school might have a different profile, but here it's more neutralized. We suggest, or we suppose, that this is because the concept of a social network over the course of the 21st century, also for teenagers, has changed. It's no longer the walls of the school, but it's really, well, also social media. They are involved in different networks. So you can see that this leads to a neutralization of the classical social classes as to the, well, the frequency of use of a feature. I'm not going into the functions. Okay. The last three questions are much shorter. So do I still have some time? 10 minutes, yeah, no problem. So the third question is about, well, who are the leaders of language change? As already said, children, adults, adolescents. How can you measure this? Well, you need to be able to check whether some feature of the beginning of the 21st century has nowadays spread to the language of their parents, their grandparents, right? So if you can find them in that speech, that would mean that, well, maybe they have contributed to language change. Now, we think we cannot do this with the corpora. We think that the corpora are just too limited. The number of data are just too limited to find any valid conclusion. So that's why this part needs to be developed through experimental methods. It's more controlled. So we will be developing two kinds of tasks, so meaning matching tasks and sentence rating tasks. And so what we will do is that indeed we will first look for those specific forms at the beginning of the century, and then we will ask adults and grandparents to what extent, for instance, they are familiar with those forms. So these are, for instance, meaning matching tasks. We would ask them, for instance, your grandmother, we would ask her, do you know what dope means? And then we give her some options. Would you use it? Yes or no? So there are different options. Or sentence rating. This is, of course, if you want to verify syntax. If you say, for instance, what the hell is wrong with you? Well, would you accept that sentence, yes or no? So this could, I hope, give us some information about the spread of some of these features. But this is still work that needs to be done. Okay, fourth question already. What about age grading? Is it true that, for instance, you guys, for the younger people here, that you are still forming your language, but then later on, it will never change again? Or we, the older ones, that our language is fixed and that we are not really, for instance, acquiring new syntactic features or whatever? It's also a complicated question to answer. Age grading, it's really how to measure that. Just to give you some first ideas, so Linda and I, when we studied intensifiers, we compared two intensifiers, namely maso. We already know that it is more expressive. It's not the most expressive one, but it's really expressive. And super, that is quite common. And then we looked at the speech of the second generation in Kolam, and we compared with the frequency of the third generation in Korma. So we think that the third generation in Korma, since it's 20 years later, that we're looking at the speech of the same generation, right? What do we see? Maso has disappeared. Although we suspect that they used it, the same participants used it when they were teenagers, they abandoned the feature when they became adults. That's not the case for super. Of course, it has to do with the fact that maso is quite associated and still with teenagers. So as an adult, as you grow older, you can also leave behind a certain number of features. I did the same thing for the pragmatic markers. So already know that en plan is really a feature of a teenagers. You see that, when they grow older, they also abandon en plan because it's not considered nice language use. There are teachers in Spanish schools that wear shirts with en plan prohibited. So they don't want their students to use it. So it's abandoned, whereas other pragmatic markers like sabes and nada that are more common, they are not abandoned. So, well, there seems to be age grading in the sense that you can leave behind some features if they are really expressive. And then, to end, what about the youth language universals? So what about the societal factors? The idea would be highly interesting to compare, for instance, Peninsular Spanish with what you guys are doing in Brazilian Teen Talk. On the one hand, these languages are typologically related. They are Romance languages, so, well, we could expect to find just similar structures, similar lexicon, but on the other hand, the societies are quite different. It's said about the American varieties that they are more innovative than the European one. This is really a generalization. But well, if you compare Peninsular Spanish with Brazilian Portuguese, I don't know what would happen. What about language contact? What about social media? I thought that here in Brazil, TikTok and the influencers also in English, but then people told me that you have a lot of Brazilian influencers. So maybe language contact is different than in Europe. So it would be really interesting. So maybe, Flavia, you could join the team of projects and collaborations. So, and now I'm really wrapping up. We already had some empirical confirmation about the fact that lexical features evolve quicker than the syntactic ones. Remember the SK, but the change isn't that dramatic, at least for the vocatives and intensifiers that we investigated. And we still need to look into the slang, the other phenomena of the lexicon. The more expressive a feature, the more rapid the change. There's something to say about the girls as well. Said they are not the girls from 20 years ago. Maybe that's a good thing. But if you look at vague language use, then there isn't too much of a difference. The concept of network also seems to have changed. It's no longer just a school, but, well, it's social media. I don't know, they get in contact with teenagers from different networks. And also age grading. Here we see that's also mostly the expressive language features that seem to be lost or that get lost over time. But, well, there is still a lot of work to be done. But anyway, thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions or suggestions, you can ask me, or for specific phenomena, of course, you can also talk to Linde, to Nede, whatever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renata. So nice. We all learn a lot. Now we're going to open for questions. If anyone would like to ask something. Wait a second.
You said that the data that you collected, and you had more girls than boys.
Yeah.
So how did you manage to, know the precision of the data?
Yeah. So already when we selected the subsamples, we took into account an equal number of boys and girls. So what the sample we worked with for Korma was not the entire one. So in order to get a balanced sample with Kolam, so we tried to get boys and girls to an equal number. But what we then did was always calculate the frequency per 10,000 words for boys, for girls. So we have really very precise data about how many words do we have for boys of the lower class, of the higher class, because, well, we can count the number of words in the conversations, and then it was always calculated relative to 10,000 words in the whole subsample for that kind of sociolect. Otherwise, well, it would really deform our results. That's true.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
It's interesting. Thank you for your presentation. It's interesting. We can compare some things. For example, in In Brazil, there is a word, sinistro. 20 years ago, this word is negative, negative polarity.
Yeah.
But 20 years ago, there was, it became positive,
A positive word.
positive word.
Okay.
And now it became again
Negative.
negative.
Yeah.
Then there's it's interesting because it was the beginning of social media 20 years ago. Not it was blogs and YouTube.
Yeah.
But at the moment it begins to, and then it's appear now.
That's interesting, and you really observe it with other items as well. So, for instance, the taboo word puto, what you would expect that it mostly has a negative connotation. So, for instance, el puto tren, so the goddamn train is always late. But Linda noticed in her data that puto can also have a positive connotation. So, for instance, la puta profesora is not necessarily the goddamn professor, but it could also be, oh, she's really nice. So yeah, they use it in an expressive way, but the prosody, the semantic prosody, can also go from negative to positive, and indeed back to negative maybe. Yeah.
Yes. The puta is an interesting word for us too.
What is it? Yeah.
Puta is intensifier and always in the in feminine form.
Okay.
Puta carro.
So
It's a great car.
there is no agreement, and they don't put it in masculine.
No, yes. It's interesting because the dictionaries it was used I don't know many more than 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But only 20 years ago it was registered for the dictionary, for example.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. And it's still like that, always
Yes,
feminine.
yes.
And do you put it in plural? No. If you would have two cars?
No. Dois puta carros.
Okay. So it's not, it has not become an adjective. Maybe it's what we call the tacos. So things that they put into, for instance, we also have in Spanish, ¿qué cojones estás haciendo? Which they put something in it, a taboo word, and it doesn't agree with the other.
But I think the hypothesis of the change is provoked by the teenagers is a good hypothesis.
By the teenagers,
Yes.
yeah.
Because
I think as well.
I think it's the moment with the words, the constructions are more
formed, created,
and sedimented.
Yeah.
Also.
Thank you. And first of all, Renata, thank you. This was a great conference, and it's great research. My specific question is about functions in these strategies of intensifiers and vocatives.
Yeah.
Did you do some, how can I say, did you related these forms with functions like, for example, es que to mean I don't know what to say about the things I was saying, or this is a transition of topic. If you did this relation with functions.
Yeah. There are Linde for the intensifier, Sfien for the vocatives, SK, that's for Nele. So we've been studying and discussing a lot the different functions. It's not easy to define it, but Linde, for instance, she has come up with a new model to define the functions of the intensifiers, quantitative, qualitative. So she also tries to, or is checking to what extent, for instance, a particular form gets more qualitative meaning. For instance, for the intensifiers, you can have a big house, but you could have a great house. Does one form go from quantitative to qualitative? The same for Fien. She has a detailed classification of the functions of the vocatives, and she also tries to see how a form might, for instance, expand the functions. SK as well, but that's a hard one. The functions of SK, it seems that it's really multifunctional. So at one point, it can have 3 functions. So you can't really cut and say, oh, here it is, for instance, I don't know, to retake an idea that was mentioned before or to topicalize or whatever. So they put it there with many different functions at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. And you seems to have big toolkit, about theoretical and methodological frameworks. And what about it? You showed us the social linguistics questions about it, but what do you say about the theoretical framework? Did you use construction grammar or another framework? What?
Still, since the focus is here a bit different than the work that we did, for instance, on, the argument structures, we think that, it's really a variationist study, historical linguistics, and the framework might restrict us too much if we would say, okay, is this a construction? For instance, at some point we discussed the possibility of considering intensification as a construction and then see whether some sub-schemas would arise. I think with the vocatives, it's not feasible. You could do it better with the intensifiers because this is an embedded phenomena. But at this point, we didn't really felt the need to formalize it through this framework. But it could be done. But maybe in the future. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
But shall I add something about this? Is that because I know the projects of the girls. This is one research question between, I think, among 4 or 5 research questions. So this is the social linguistic description, but they also have the behavior profile analysis for Fien, for example, when the vocatives are used with this and that function. And of course, they all do the description of the functions and forms beforehand. So it's not just the social linguistic analysis and the hypothesis and stuff, but
their PhD goes broader than that. So they study intensification, they study vocatives, and me, as I'm interested in linguistic change, so there is a part on and that's then where we collaborate. But then I'm there to try to get an helicopter view. But their work is
I'm saying this because here in Brazil, one research question would be the whole thesis.
Okay.
One of your research questions would be the complete thesis, for example. So just the description of the form and function that will be considered, I told you that before, would be considered as as okay for a PhD thesis or a master's work. Whereas there, in their works, Linde and Fien and Nele is just one part. And Fien, for example, the description of the vocatives she had done in her tesina, the bachelor's tesina.
Bachelor and master.
Yes, and the master's tesina. So the PhD is another.
She's also working with the personality features.
Personality
mentioned
features
here, but who uses the vocatives?
Yeah.
Where and why and
She's going to introduce herself because she's for the bachelor,
and linguistics.
Okay.
So my name is Julia.
Hi, Julia.
I really like the lecture.
Thank you.
And now I was curious to ask if you observed or question if there's more variation in the last 2 decades than like in the past century because of the social media and like the teenagers are getting so much power, as you said in the beginning, and communication and like TikTok is amazing. Like 1 billion people, 1 billion teenagers are in TikTok.
Yeah.
And I question if there's more change, more variation now and more quickly than like in the past century.
That's what we would expect if we see what happens in general. But unfortunately, we don't have data from teenagers from, well,
Other time
20th
periods.
century. Yeah. If you think that the first oral data for Spanish, but in general, be it an interview and whatever generation, is a very isolated corpus from the 70s. From the 80s, we don't have a lot. And then in the 90s, it starts, but it's mostly general for all generations, adults. So we don't have anything that allows us to systematically look at those phenomena. We could study, for instance, I don't know, movies, but well, still, you're not sure that what the language that you're observing there was the real teenage talk, because it's more scripted, etc., etc. But from what we see that is happening over the last 20 years, I think you could say that now there is more variation than before, but you're not sure. We're not sure. Yeah.
And another thing, like it seems to me that adults don't want to be related to teens, like in the language.
Yeah.
And teens don't want to be related to adults.
No.
So
That's indeed the fact is that they do live together. And what happens is that, the language of the teenagers very quickly moves to the language of their parents. I have 2 teenage sons at home, and I notice I don't want to do it, but without being aware of it, you copy some of their behavior. And then after some time, they're like, "Oh, mom, please stop saying that." And of course, if this happens in all the families, then they might decide as a group to abandon that feature. And then I think the adults mostly, they also abandon it. It's a really interesting an interesting relationship, I would say.
yeah, very. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are questions in the YouTube. People are... So, Thaisa says that, thank you for your talk. Renato, one interesting topic would be to compare Brazilian and European Portuguese, since European young speakers of Portuguese are being influenced by Brazilian Portuguese. And I shall add that there is a Brazilian YouTuber called, Lucas Neto. I don't know how many millions and millions and millions of followers he has on YouTube and other social media. And in Portugal, they're complaining that the miúdos are speaking Brazilian and not speaking the best Portuguese in the world.
Well, that would also be
European
a phenomenon
Portuguese
of language contact, but then not with English, but with the same. Also very interesting. Maybe then the change goes more quickly because it's the same language. It would be really interesting. Yeah. Thank you for the
because of Brazilian digital influencers. So Vitória Figueroa, who is a student of our course, como essas questões influenciam na aprendizagem do espanhol como língua estrangeira para nós, brasileiros, visto que não aprendemos apenas o espanhol peninsular? How do these questions could influence their learning of Spanish as a foreign language.
And who's learning then?
We Brazilians, we are
Okay.
learning Spanish
Yeah.
as a
Non-native speaker.
non-native
Yeah,
foreign language,
Yeah.
but we don't. Well, I think what she's in fact asking is that you. I think it's that the point that you mentioned just the peninsular variety,
Yeah.
but you do have data from other varieties.
Well, we do, but we didn't do any systematic research on that. But for instance, the Colam corpus has also a variant for Argentinians. So there is a corpus for Buenos Aires, another one for Santiago de Chile. So these data exist. And how would it affect your language learning? It depends on how you guys learn Spanish here. If I compare with how we learn Spanish, we do it with textbooks. And well, at least when I learned it, I don't know how many years ago, it was with very serious dialogues. We wouldn't learn taboo words nor pragmatic markers. So I don't think these specific features would affect, well, that's not the natural language that you would learn. But of course, if you're in an advanced level, your teachers ask you to, I don't know, to watch YouTube channels or TikTok, then you might get it. But we notice that even our students in the highest level of Spanish, they don't get those spontaneous, informal features. Therefore, they have to go on Erasmus or they have to go to, I don't know, for a long stay abroad. Yeah.
Yes, in the same line, Thalita Storti Garcia, she's from Unesp. She says, Hola Renata, enhorabuena por la excelente charla. Me gustaría saber un poco más sobre el uso de tío, tía. Esos nuevos usos no son tratados en libros didácticos y cuando son nos dicen que tía es un término más vulgar que tío.
Yeah.
Por lo que vemos en su investigación, eso ya no ocurre. Eu falando espanhol, vocês estão vendo. Tía también se usa como vocativo, como vemos en tío.
Yes. So, well, the fact that the form has spread means that at the same time it has grammaticalized more and more, or pragmaticalized. And you could say, well, Finn is struggling with that. We are struggling with that. For hombre, hombre, for instance, is it a vocative or is it a pragmatic marker? That's not that you use not to address another person. And what we see in the conversations between the girls of the upper class that really abuse the form of tia is that they don't always use it as to address and say, well, listen to me, tia, I call your attention and now I'm saying something. It's like, it's becoming a pragmatic marker. So it no longer has a vulgar meaning. And I don't know if it would have had it before, maybe at the beginning. It's a dialect connotation, vernacular, that's for sure. But well, now I think no, it's becoming common in the language. But of course, the older generations, they wouldn't use it as much. So it is a feature of the younger generations. Yeah, it's not excluded because, well, with language change, what I'm saying today might already be different tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So last question is from Sebastião Carlos Gonçalves. She's from our group, research group, the Grupo de Estudos Sociofuncionalistas. And Sebastião was the one who proposed the corpus Iboruna that we used in our project that we submitted, but it wasn't unfortunately approved, despite the good reviews.
Yeah.
Then we planned to create what was the name? Sancor, something like this. Corpus de São Carlos. Corsanca. It was something like this. Corpus de São Carlos. And the Iboruna that Sebastião organized would be the millennial,
reference.
millennial source of comparison, but it wasn't approved. And maybe, as I'm here in the slide, maybe, who knows? And then here, maybe, who knows? And then Sebastião is asking a methodological question about the corpus. Thanks for your talk. My question is, how much could a corpus of recontact of the same individuals help in verifying the change in behavior in the individual and in the group?
I don't know if I fully understand the question.
Again, how much could a corpus of recontact?
Recontact.
Yeah, as you did with the comma and with the column and the comma, could help us in verifying the change in behavior in the individual and in the group.
Well, what you have, of course, there are always restrictions. Yeah. So in the ideal case, you would be able to have a longitudinal study and really follow the same participants over time. That's really a real-time comparison, right? But it's impossible. Well, at least in 20 years, if I would start now in 20 years, I don't know if I would be able to finish that, right? So we don't have that data. So you have to make the best use of, well, sometimes they say bad data. But what we tried, we did have a corpus of including 500 participants. So we believe that it's not a limited corpus that you have like just a lot of words that are spoken by few participants, because then you can really observe idiosyncratic language behavior. So here, by including as much participants as possible, we think that we have a good balance or an overview or a cut of what could be happening in society, right? But of course, and I hope I try to do it also in this talk, we're always working with hypotheses. Like I said at the beginning, you start with chaos, you try to find patterns, but you always have to be humble and ask yourself, if I see structure and order, is it something that I want to see or is it really there? But of course, we will never know because we are not working with the real populations. We are working with samples. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I hope so. I think it's very interesting. And the problem here, as I told Renata a couple of years ago, and I think you know that, is that we don't have, I think Iboruna is the best spoken corpus in Brazilian Portuguese, but nowadays we couldn't do this kind of research, as we don't have this. We have to create the corpus, and as you said, it's very expensive. It demands a team and energy, and well, that's it. Yeah. So maybe it would be possible in the future. Yeah. Here in Brazil, we don't use tia and tio, but they use véi.
Véi.
From it's old. It's velho. And mano. Mano.
The hermano.
Huh?
That's the bro.
The hermano is mano, mana.
That's the bro.
And véi.
Well, uncle is also an old person, so there is something with by the idea. Well, okay.
Véi, all the time. Yeah. And I think it's widespread. There is no Yes.
Tipo?
And tipo, kind of. No, it's different because it's kind of.
Tipo. Yeah.
Like.
Yeah. It's also, well, it also occurs in Spanish. Yeah.
And I think it's widespread between boys and girls. And just to finish, it's just a methodological question that we addressed in the project, and that I want to know if you have any thoughts about this, about the gender.
Yeah.
And if they declare girl, boy, or in view of the new realities that we have nowadays, how would you deal with this? And if you you've done this,
So,
because
yeah.
there's also something from the first wave of the
of
social
course.
linguistics that gay people had a specific way of speaking.
It's really interesting as well, but I think that is a separate research domain. Again, if you have particular gender identities, to what extent you can see it in the linguistic behavior as a continuum. So, for instance, when Fien collected her most recent data about the personality, so for the personality, and then so she also recorded the corpus when they played a game. So, and then she transcribed, etc., etc. But Uno, yeah. Uno, yeah. And also there was a map task. They had to describe some way to get through some place. And then she recorded how they interacted. But she provided them with a questionnaire with metadata before. So there was the personality test, but also they could indicate I identify as, so my gender is this or that, my age. So yeah, I think if I would redo the work with Korma, I would also take that into account. But I must say that in 7 years, and when we started, in fact, in 2015, the world has changed a lot as to those gender identities as well. So we were caught in speed with that. But on the other hand, I think that although it's really interesting and important, at some point as a researcher, you have to make generalizations and abstractions. And so for us, gender is biological gender, and not really, and not the identity. Although again, that would be really interesting. But I think that's a separate project. So I would invite people to record their own corpus then, taking it to taking into account that as a parameter. You cannot do everything, but yeah. But we have metadata as well, that's for sure, but not so detailed.
Any other questions? No? So thank you so much again, Renata,
Thank you.
for coming, for giving this talk. As you see, we have a lot of work to do in Brazilian Portuguese that could be used in comparison to Spanish, Peninsular Spanish, and Brazilian Portuguese with European Portuguese, and Peninsular Spanish with other varieties from Spanish as well. So as Renata said, I think it was yesterday, about after finishing her PhD, that he thought, oh my God, what am I going to do now that I finished my PhD? What am I going to study? Well, there are millions and millions of things to be done. And this path about variation and language change is something that it's really interesting, and well, maybe in another life.
I'll try to do this. Over yet.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good finish. Oh no, please! I have to thank Fernando, the IT guy from our center, who is helping us. Who is helping us to stream this conference. Thank you very much, Fernando. That's it. Good afternoon.